So, when I was in university, I studied art history as well as writing. And one of the interesting things I learned about was that mid decade is usually when said decade earns its identity. And by the time uh, by the time Janis Joplin was popular, along with her contemporaries like Jim Morrison and Jimi Hendrix, people like that. Um, that was, around that time, 66, 67. And the turbulent 60s kind of identity was formed. And, uh, you know, was reflected with the way that law enforcement was kind of involved in 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 their lives. Janis Joplin was arrested for telling the cops to stop bothering people in her audience. She used profanity, and that was indecent, and they arrested her after her show and fined her. I think it was $200 or something, which is a lot of money in 1969 money. uh, so you know but they had to make a show of it. They had to make a spectacle. She had to be made an example of, uh, and I just find it interesting, considering what we're seeing today, mid-decade. It's just kind of interesting to me. So anyway, in referencing that short video uh, that I saw where she was explaining how she became a singer when she was already a singer, I made a short about it where I snipped that. So if you haven't seen it, that's sort of what inspired me on this path. And it's funny because artists like her were kind of following in the 1950s footsteps of, I'm thinking of writers like Jack Kerouac and Lawrence Ferlinghetti and the Beat poets and writers of that period. Um, it was like a continuation of that, because by the late 60s, it was as though artists were tired of the monotony, the kind of the lull of mediocrity. And I'm not here as a person who was not alive yet in those decades to criticize that. Um, but I understand it from an academic sort of place, uh, in that post war, there was an eagerness to adopt conservative ways. It was attractive. That's why it seems counterintuitive to us that why would women want to go backwards after they, worked as riveters and parachute makers and, you know, makers of grenades, things like that in the war effort. Why would they go from being badasses like that to, you know, going home, being in the home, having kids, and all of this? In my estimation, the reason that was attractive is because it was normal. It felt safe. It felt very lovely after a 6-year war, where nothing was normal and survival mode was the mode, right? Mediocrity seems like a great achievement after times of difficulty like that. So that's why the same women who, yeah, wore pants and worked really hard and took care of their homes and their kids as best they could and all of that, um, that's why they would want to take the pants off and wear dresses and aprons and have families and not have to work outside the home, right? Um, that was freedom, I feel. I'm not going to say that as an absolute thing or truth or whatever. It's just, it seems to me, from my background and, my education post-secondary. So there was an instructor that I had who said it was a cultural wasteland in the 1950s. Nothing happened of cultural significance, really. Of course, that's speaking very broadly and very generally. That's not an absolute truth. That's not what I'm saying or trying to imply, but it's true. There was a huge sort of lull. And then, you know, um, popular culture kind of was like, yay, lull. We want that to be what people strive for. That's, and that should be, and that's the American dream, and that's all that anybody should ever want. So by the time people like Janis Joplin were showing up and being like, yeah, we want more, not all of us want to do that. Not all of us want to be housewives. It's not for everyone. Some people are cool with it, but some of us aren't, you know? And that should be allowed. I think that was sort of where she was coming from all the time. And people like her contemporaries. They were bored with the status quo because it was incredibly limiting. Uh, and if you wanted to be an artist, if you wanted to have bold commentary about anything, that was seen as a threat, right? And that's why there was this strong police presence, I noticed, in, those kinds of environments where concerts were held. And, the musicians, the front people for the bands, were arrested, or sometimes they had to make court appearances, stuff like this. They were made examples of all the time as these bad influences, these bad apples. We can't have that. It's interesting to contrast that with popular culture and what was approved of. There was this image, and I, as a kid growing up in the 90s, I watched a lot of old TV shows. It was interesting. It was like archaeology. Not to sound disrespectful or anything, but it really was. It was intellectual for me to sit there and be like, what made that funny? What made that interesting? Because I know many, 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 many people watched these shows, uh, and got something out of them, like, the family image that was so heavy, heavily kind of leaned into by popular culture then, like, and they often had magic involved. A lot of TV shows, like I Dream of Jeannie, and uh, Bewitched, and like Leave It to Beaver. Those kind of shows are kind of what are showing up in my head right now. Um, the image of, yeah, June and Ward Cleaver as these perfect people, these perfect parents, and their kids were perfect. They would get into trouble, and then in 20 minutes the problem would be solved, right? I appreciate TV is not real, but nonetheless, we like to think that it kind of has roots in reality, and it doesn't. But people like Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison, people that unfortunately were lost very quickly in life. They didn't live long. It's because that's what they were trying to show us. They were trying to remind people that there is more to keep seeking for and questing for. And again, as a kid looking back at it, I could see what the younger generation, like Janis Joplin, her generation, what they were talking about and be like, right, I don't think that was achieved, what they were looking for and what they were singing about, what they were trying to do. It feels like we gave up because I don't see the kind of freedom and artistic expression that 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 they were advocating for and kind of putting themselves on the line for in a kind of way, right? And in the end, one could argue that they, Janice, will just stick with her, she kind of ended up being kind of sacrificed in a way, because of the kind of desire to make an impact, and all people seemed to want to do was hassle her because she was a woman and she was trying to be in the blues and rock environment, which was very much dominated by men at that time. Uh, Not saying she was the only female blues singer by any means, but she was a popular one, and people knew her and still know her as that. And at the time when she was being that person, she had to face the stupid questions that are just because she's a woman questions, like why do you sing blues and why do you not sing, you know traditional ballads like somebody else who is a female artist. She That just wasn't her way, and I think of her in a similar vein, kind of, as Karen Carpenter, because she was interested in kind of the spine of the music. She was good with rhythm. There's a few pictures I've seen of her at a drum kit. It looked like kind of a jazz drum kit. It was smaller, uh, and she was in a silver kind of sequined mini dress. I think it was at the Monterey Pop Festival or something like that. It was something akin to Woodstock. I don't think it was Woodstock in those particular shots that I've seen. But she had an affinity for drumming. She had an affinity for that kind of the the bedrock of singing a song. You know, that's why she could be so raw with her performance, and that's was just natural for her. Um, and what's natural for some people is not natural for others. Um, that's why Karen Carpenter showed up later, a little later, and she was very much part of the establishment. So it was kind of, yes, she faced some pushback about being a girl drummer, absolutely, but it was a little easier for her too because she was not singing rock and roll. She was not singing, that really, I don't know what to call it, in 1960s and 70s vernacular, but today it seems like she was singing, like in our parlance, kind of alternative, sort of. I'm certainly not qualified to be giving labels like that officially, but that's sort of what it feels like we would call her today. But I don't know. Maybe you have a better idea than I do. Anyway, I think that's the bulk of what I have on that. I could go on and on and on, and you know that I can. You've seen me do it. But I think that's why I was attracted to uh, an artist or a music like that myself, is because I wondered what were people like Simon and Garfunkel talking about when they were, We've all come to look for America, right? What do you mean? What are you looking for, right? That's what I was asking when I was hearing the words. Um, and same thing with what was somebody like Janis Joplin sort of grappling with. And it was that. It was, being wanting to have the ability to choose to be different. And in honor of that, I'm wearing my silliest glasses because that's something I really identify with too. With Janis Joplin, is she wore more extreme things as the lead of her band. uh, she had the imagery that we know, right? Great big smile a lot of the time, great big round glasses. Often that's what I think of when I think of her. I think of the image that I remember of her on like the Dick Cavett show, like right at the very end of her life, unfortunately. She had like a purple like boa on her head. It wasn't a boa like we know it, but it was on her head somehow. I don't know how they attached it, but there it was, like on her head as like an extension of her hair. She took conventional things like feather boas, and instead of wearing them like around her neck, they were on her head. And instead of just round glasses, they were oversized round glasses. uh, and I think it was that was from her kind of mainstream background from Texas, where she was from, and reinterpreted. And that was kind of reflecting back to society. We are allowed to be different. We can interpret these things that we have, like feather boas and glasses, in a new way. And that's okay. We should be allowed to do that. It's not a threat. That's sort of what I get out of it. Again, being that much younger and having not been in that moment culturally. I'm just looking back on it, right? So I think that's probably where I should leave it. Um, and I hope you've appreciated my nod to Janis with my silliest glasses. These are officially my silliest pair of glasses. They're heavy, and I can't wear them for very long because they always fall down my nose and end up like right there. So they're heavy and big. So I hope you've enjoyed. Again, suggest to me other artists that you're interested in me kind of going over just a little bit. And I think I might be interested in kind of carrying on this vein, maybe, talking a little bit about Jim Morrison, because he was interesting as well. And I think I can think of a few things to say about him. So, with that, I hope you'll like, follow, subscribe, leave comments, all that good jazz or blues. And I will see you in the next one.